Okay, now the lecture's recorded. So aside from that, are there any questions about the lecture? I don't know if you guys think this is like a good move with the activities. I don't know if you guys want more practice from the SAQ or LAQ or etc. Um, if you want to put in your input, feel free to do so, like now, um, before we start off. Some SAQs would be nice. Yeah. Another part of the reason why is just I didn't have time to write good questions that would be suitable for the review session. I would have loved to include a handful of good questions, and I might do that at the end. I mean, you might watch me do it live when I add slides. It will depend if we have enough time as well. There's a chance I might go over time. We'll see. Not that this particular part of Unit 4 is going to be heavy in any way. It's just, I don't know. There's a variety of factors. But if you guys do want to take a look at SAQs and like an MCQ, probably not an analysis question because it takes a while to actually look for good documents for analysis. But if you guys do want MCQs and SAQs after I finish, let me know at the end, and I will probably write out some or take a look at College Board past FRQs to give you guys well, the MCQ will be appended to the slides live because College Board doesn't post their MCQs live, only the sample exam questions. But for SAQs, I will probably just screen share an SAQ for you guys to look at, and that will probably be about it. Okay. So 5 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock. I made a little announcement about the activities we've been doing for the lecture. It's not going to be as jam-packed, but if you guys do want more activities at the end, feel free to let me know. Again, I'll make this announcement once we reach the end. Okay? So today's the second part of Unit 4. Before we start, again, complimentary preliminaries. Part of Five Hive. It's a volunteering organization. If you want to come help out, feel free to do so. Just apply. It's all on a rolling basis. Here's the feedback that I mentioned. If you guys do want to have, feedback ingrained in the agenda, the planned agenda, let me know on this. I do read through the feedback every now and then. Not every day, but I read it quite frequently. That'll be great. You can scan the QR code or the link. I think MMBCSmen is in here, so if you can post that, that would be nice. I think he's probably working on that. A disclaimer, of course, College Board is not affiliated with us. We are not endorsed by them. We're only here to help you out, but we cannot guarantee a 5, unfortunately. We will try our best to make sure that you maximize your chances of 5, but expectations, the usual, be respectful. The lecture is recorded. If you need to leave early, feel free to do so. The recordings will be uploaded on the lecture calendar. It's under announcements, Lance's announcement. So yeah. So here's a little review of the agenda. As you can see, we're doing one less activity, and that's the SAQ. So we covered Jefferson's era. We talked about the growing sectional conflict. And we particularly talked about the market revolution. That was probably the most important part. Let me just check the chat if there are any questions. Nope. And then we left off with expanding democracy, particularly talking about Jacksonian democracy. And we'll pick that up. Let me just... here. And we'll pick that up with actually talking about Jackson himself. It says MCQ1 there, but it should be just MCQ. Again, if I add more MCQs in the SAQ, then I will change this agenda. So if you go through the slides, it'll be a little different. So, just a brief recap of Jacksonian democracy, because that was a bit of a cliffhanger. Jacksonian democracy is going to start becoming relevant in the election of 1828. Before, in 1824, we saw the election of John Quincy Adams. Jackson was his opponent. Jackson called this a corrupt bargain, and Jackson proclaimed himself to be kind of like the man of the people. And at the time, for the most part, the only people who could vote were landed, white, and men. And when I say landed, they had to own property. But by the time of 1828, we're gonna see, we're gonna see just in general all white men enfranchised through a variety of means. So that's what's particularly important about 1828 and Jackson himself. Another thing we need to also recap is the second party system. Remember, the first party system was Democratic Republicans versus Federalists. But after the War of 1812, the Federalists will kind of fall apart. They'll lose steam. Now, in this second party system, we're going to have, again, two parties, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. And this time, the Democratic and the Whig Party are going to be kind of split along sectional conflicts and regional interests again. So, brief recap. The Democratic Party was mainly consisting of smaller Southern planters, immigrants, and workers. They opposed moral reforms via the government, and they were a little bit more of a states' rights kind of group. The Whigs were mainly wealthy supporters of the American system, and if you do not remember the American system, just know that it is an economic plan that mainly benefited manufacturing. It was a plan to stimulate the American economy. Most of the Whigs saw themselves as modernizers. They were there to improve society and morals, etc., etc. Okay, now let's actually move on to Jackson's presidency. So, 3 points about Jackson's presidency I want to bring up. The first one is the Bank War. Now, the Bank War, a lot of you guys will probably remember, is kind of Jackson's beef with Nicholas Biddle, the guy who's in charge of the Second U.S. Bank. But a little bit of backstory. In 1819, we had this entire panic. And basically, all you need to know about the Panic of 1819 is economic chaos. And what many people did was they blamed the Second Bank of the United States. And this is going to be one of the things that the Democrats will run on throughout 1828 and 1832, which is Jackson's re-election. When the Second Bank of the United States is going to have its charter renewed, the Supreme Court will defend it. It's going to declare it constitutional. But Jackson's going to look at that ruling and say, nope, I don't care about that. And so he's going to veto the charter. He's going to implement policies that are going to constantly weaken the bank over and over. In place of the Second Bank of the United States, he's going to favor pet banks, kind of in a series of spoils, right? He's going to spoil these banks that are going to follow his, key beliefs. So basically, instead of soft money, he's going to focus on hard money. The problem with these pet banks, though, and hard money is that it's going to lead to the Panic of 1837. So make that of you will about the Panic of 1837. Historians do link directly the Panic of 1837 and the collapse of the Second Bank of the United States. Again, remember the purpose of the National Bank was to make sure the economy was not going to die. That's what the Fed Reserve does, actually, these days. Make sure that, well, it's supposed to make sure that the economy doesn't die. I mentioned the spoils system. That is something you also should know about Jackson himself. He basically favored people who supported him directly instead of giving out his positions to people who were very well qualified. A good example of this will be Roger B. Taney, and if you heard of Roger B. Taney, he's the, I don't want to use a strong word, but just know he was the Chief Justice during the Dred Scott decision. You guys will probably be able to assume what my impression of Taney is from that. The next thing is going to be about the nullification crisis. I don't know why I put up the force bill. That is something Jackson will sign, but the force bill is related to the nullification crisis. So what's the nullification crisis? We kind of went over it before already, but if you don't remember, southern states are not going to like a series of tariffs. We're going to have a tariff in, I don't know why I'm blanking on it. It should be 1822 or There's going to be a series of tariffs that they'll call the tariffs of abominations. It should be 1828. I was off by 6 years. Anyways, just know that the southern states are going to hate tariffs. So 1828 is going to be the tariff of abominations. Jackson will pass the tariffs of 1832 as an attempt to placate the southern states, but this is still not going to work. And so, what the southern states are, specifically South Carolina under John C. Calhoun, is they're going to propose the theory of nullification. And they're going to use this idea that states could declare tariffs unconstitutional and not enforce them. The reason why they were kind of, huge on this whole tariffs being unconstitutional thing, and they're making a big deal out of this as well, they expected Jackson to do something about these tariffs. And when they saw that he didn't really make too much of a change from 1828 to 1832, well, they got angry about it. Now, the question of constitutionality, this was a matter of, could states determine whether or not something was constitutional? John Quincy Adams is going to argue for the Supreme Court, that only the Supreme Court could determine whether or not things were constitutional. And as it turns out, Jackson's actually going to agree with him on this part. Jackson's actually going to also turn to Henry Clay, absolute Chad, by the way, who will negotiate the compromise tariff of 1833 to defuse the situation. Jackson's also going to try to get this force bill passed. And what this force bill is all about is, well, he's basically telling South Carolina to suck it up and do those tariffs. And if they're not going to do those tariffs, well, he's going to enforce it physically with force, like military. So those are two cases of Jackson extending his federal power to some extent to reach his own goals. Now, the last one is probably going to be the most infamous things he does: Indian removal. Context of Indian removal: Americans have been expanding west. They have also been expanding into Spanish Florida. I included a map of Indian removal. If you look at Spanish Florida and the little bottom parts of Mississippi, Alabama, and all that, that was territory gained previously, before the Indian Removal Act was signed in 1830. What Native Americans are going to do in response to these expansion, hopefully you guys still remember, they're going to resist with violence. So a series of wars are going to break out: the Seminole Wars, the Creek War, the Black Hawk War, etc., etc. But one key issue that Jackson wanted to do was to take Native American tribes and relocate them to another place, so to make space in the South for plantations. So the 5 civilized tribes, he's going to sign the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This is the thing that will kick things off. And the 5 civilized tribes are going to fight back, mainly the Cherokee. So what the Cherokee are going to do is they're going to argue in the Supreme Court that the federal government doesn't really have any right to throw them out of their ancestral homeland. So in Cherokee v. Georgia, the Supreme Court's going to say, yeah, you do, but also you're not citizens of the United States, technically. Your own thing. And they're going to affirm it again in Worcester v. Georgia, where they say, yeah, Native American nations are sovereign, and we don't have any business with forcing them to move around. Now, Jackson's going to hear this, and he's going to say this: Marshall made his decision, let him enforce it. He's going to completely ignore the Supreme Court stuff. And then he's going to, go on with the process of Indian removal, forcing them on the Trail of Tears, all that. A bunch of Native Americans will die, and they will all be forced in an unfamiliar territory in modern-day Oklahoma. Yeesh. So not a good look there. All 3 of these instances, what College Board wants you to do is that even though Jackson was kind of one of the people that opposed the federal government's overreach, in some ways, he actually expanded federal power, and this is actually a point that AP Gov will probably make, is that throughout the years in American history, presidents have expanded federal power. And we're going to see this notion return again when we discuss FDR. But that's all you need to know about Jackson. So, are there any questions about Andrew Jackson? Don't ask me what sandwiches he ate. I don't think he ate anything good. Continuity. Yes, that's what he meant by when he said corrupt bargain. He said that 1824 was a corrupt bargain. That's what he means. And the election was stolen. Well, I can see why a certain person. Anyways. Any more questions about Jackson in regards to federal power specifically? I want to make sure that this is a point that I emphasize a lot. Well, we're on the same wavelength. Pretty straightforward so far. I did summarize what I talked about. So the federal power thing, the issue will actually start from the beginning. In regards to the Constitution or the powers and the roles of the federal government. Start with Washington. Remember Whiskey Rebellion. He asserted the idea that the federal government would be capable and would have the power to deal with political unrest. So yeah. Now, obviously, they were testing the Constitution rather than, the whole federal power thing. Jackson's where we see the expansion of federal power. What is Jacksonian democracy? So Jacksonian democracy describes the phenomena that where we expand the right to vote from only white man who had property to any white man. So if you're a white man in this time in 1828, you could vote. Okay. Any more questions about Jackson? Looks like no one has any more questions. So yeah. Let's move on to an MCQ, which is the only MCQ, not the first MCQ. So, which of the following best explains Jackson's role in expanding federal power? Read through choices A, B, C, D, and I'll give you guys a minute to make your choice. It will not be a poll. Just spoiler your answer. If you don't know how to use the spoiler thing, that's all right. By 5:17, I'll just ask all of you guys to make your response. Make sure I'm recording. Okay, I am recording. As for the people at home, I'm sorry. I noticed that I haven't been really friendly to people watching the recording. Here's the full screen stuff. Feel free to pause and then think about it for a minute, and we will look through. There we go. It is actually 5:17, but I'm going to give you guys like a handful of more seconds, because when I said that, it was kind of like halfway through. Or maybe 5:18 would be a fair place to go in and check. No, I think that should be enough time for people. How are we feeling? Do you guys need more time? Well, it is 5:18, so I think we're going to look through responses. So I'm going to click on these spoilers. I'm seeing a lot of C's. So for anyone who picked part C, choice C, would you care to explain why you picked choice C in the chat? I'm seeing some people typing, so I'll give them some time to finish their thoughts. By the way, let me know if I'm talking too fast, because I realize that sometimes I tend to just speed through stuff. I read that one feedback someone did. So, well, welcome, Freddie. So Star Revamp says it's C because of the nullification crisis where he threatened them with the army, plus the Trail of Tears were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. You particularly mean that he basically just emphasized the idea that the executive office is, more powerful and shouldn't bend down to such rulings. Is that what you mean? Okay. Remus brings up the same thing as well. Noodle says that they didn't pick C because it seemed a little too vague. What did you pick? Oh, okay. Would you care to explain why you picked B rather than C? For those of you recording, here's a reminder of what the choices are. Oh, God. It's really cold in here for some reason. You're not really sure how to explain it? Isn't LA supposed to be nice and sunny? For some reason, it's cold in here. I think it might be the air conditioning that my roommate has on. I will probably turn it off. Anyways, you're not really sure how to explain it. Insomnia says they think C because it's asking for the role, and B, the cause for the expansion. So let's read through B and C. It seems that people have used process of elimination to take out A and D. That they're not the answers. And yes, A and D are not correct. So B is Jackson greatly expanded federal power in order to suppress his political opponents, such as John C. Calhoun, during the nullification crisis. C was Jackson asserted the powers of the executive office over the states and the Supreme Court in order to fulfill his goals. So, I think causation and effect might not be the best way of explaining your answer choices, but I think I see where you're coming from here. So I think it's time that we discuss what the correct answer is. Correct answer is C. Now the reason why it is not B is a certain clause here. In order to suppress his political opponents such as John C. Calhoun during the nullification crisis. John C. Calhoun, and by the way, here's a key detail. John C. Calhoun and Jackson were kind of in the same party. They were on the same wavelength outside when Jackson was outside of the presidency. They both argued the same kinds of things regarding slavery and all that. Now, the reason why Part C is better than Part B, it's not great, right? It's vague. Please don't write this if this is like a thesis thing. Jackson asserted the powers of the executive office over the states and the Supreme Court in order to fulfill his goals. That last part is going to be going over the nullification crisis, which is the states part. And ignoring the Supreme Court, that's the Indian removal stuff. And technically the bank war. But we don't really talk about the bank war too much because, God, Indian removal is just a better demonstration of it, right? So this kind of explain, and the whole reason with that, by the way, is in order to reach his goals. It is vague. You are correct. But the reason why B is a little worse is that it's not entirely correct. Yeah, being vague, I guess, it would be the better option, right? But do know that this is not a good response to the question if it was open-ended. So, again, if you're responding to a DBQ or an SAQ, don't respond this way. Don't respond with part C, but also don't respond it with part B. You want to do a mixture of both. You want to be accurate, and you also want to be particular or specific. Any questions about this MCQ? The main issue was whether or not John C. Calhoun was being explicitly suppressed. Is this MCQ considered hard? To be honest, at the time of writing, I thought it was on the easier side, but now that I read through it, I think part B might have been choice B might have been a bit of a cruel distractor on my end. You won't have horrible distractors like this. It's just I like to write distractors into my MCQs, which is why people hate me. Yeah, one of the key issues was that John C. Calhoun was not particularly a political opponent. He was more just being a baby. Anyways. No. In all seriousness, the key point is that he's not necessarily suppressing John C. Calhoun's kind of rights. He's more of just telling off John C. Calhoun. Even then, it's mainly Henry Clay who's just negotiating this whole thing. Again, the force bill is not an exact suppression. He never ended up really using the military in that scenario. Maybe that might have been a good detail to note. The question is, someone asked, how did the Panic of 1837 happen? So after the National Bank takes the L from Jackson, I can't take myself seriously after that. After the National Bank dies, effectively, Jackson's going to rely on... Poor Van Buren. Jackson's going to rely on a series of pet banks. And the reason why he relies on these pet banks is, well, they're going to bend the knee to him. They're going to obey him. It's kind of like part of the spoils system. Not exactly the spoils system. The spoils system is giving people offices for being your supporter. But these pet banks are going to adopt similar policies to that Jackson will promote. Part of it's going to be hard money. But the main issue with the hard money stuff is, well, it's not good. Trust me, bro. This will lead to a series of events that will lead to an economic panic, the Panic of 1837. You don't need to necessarily know the details of the Panic of 1837, the road to it, or the fact that it happened. But you do need to know that Jackson asserted his federal power, his position as the executive, to, get his goals done. That is, getting rid of the National Bank. If you do want more details about the Panic of 1837, I can talk about it at the end. If you want to stay. Hi, Rush. Do you think I can run? Run for what? Office? All the recorded lectures are going to be in announcements on the lecture calendar. Okay. Now let's continue on to something that's a little less important, but it is kind of a vibe. Something that's less depressing than the Indian removal stuff. Oh, by the way, before I move on, am I going too fast? Am I talking too fast? Is the content going by too fast? No? Okay. Just making sure. Because I don't want to leave people behind. Alright. Let's get started with 4.9. 4.9 is not going to be tested too much, but it is something cool to know because I love culture. Anyways, American culture. That's 4.9. So what's it all about? Well, what College Board wants you to know, or what's outlined in the CED, is that we had a variety of influences from liberal values, from European movements, artistic movements, and kind of the national identity. And all of that's going to fuse together to form unique movements in art, in architecture, and in literature. So let's talk about the literature part. For those of you who have taken maybe AP Lang at the same time as APUSH, I don't know if this is a universal experience, but if you did take AP Lang here in California or at my school, then you would have learned about the American literature and all that fun stuff. I'm not going to give you all the spiel with American literature, but we're going to talk about two movements or two schools in the American 19th century literature stuff. So the first movement is going to be Transcendentalism. In some way, this is not exactly literary. This is rather philosophical in nature. So Transcendentalism is going to be more philosophical than religious. It's going to be kind of a spirituality that emphasizes the relationship between humans and nature. It's going to criticize society as a way to corrupt human beings. And by the way, these transcendentalists will believe that humans are naturally good, but it is the society that corrupts their nature. And if you want to connect this to a previous philosopher from the Enlightenment, make that connection in your head while I yap about it. Things that transcendentalists valued in human beings was independence and self-reliance. So key writers of the Transcendentalist movement are going to be Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, both of whom are quite well revered in Harvard because Harvard was a big fan of this. In fact, the Emerson Library at Harvard is named after Emerson, and they have a full-on quote from Emerson at the gates of Harvard. So that's one small detail, but it doesn't matter. Now, the key works, Walden and Self-Reliance, will all illustrate these ideas of connection with nature, kind of being separate from society, the idea of, self-reliance and all that, all these good virtues in humans that society will corrupt, but can be restored in a relationship with nature. By the way, these aren't the types of guys to go out and look at grass and stare at grass for like 2 hours straight. This is more of a spiritual sense, not a literal sense of zoning out. Another key thing I want to mention about Transcendentalism is that some of its influences are going to transfer over to the reform movements that we'll discuss in 4.11. So, for example, Margaret Fuller, who was a Transcendentalist herself, will be an early feminist, and she's going to write some ideas that will be closely related to the feminist movement. The first feminist movement is this that we'll see officially start off in 1848, but of course we have our fair share of feminists before 1848, which is obvious. Another movement that will be linked with Transcendentalism will be the abolitionist movement. Basically, the movement demanding the emancipation of slaves and giving back African Americans rights. So that's all you need to know about Transcendentalism. You don't need to be a literary scholar on all that. I included a view of Walden Pond, by the way, if you were curious. So let's move on to American Romanticism. So American Romanticism will have its influences from European Romanticism. Am I going to define European Romanticism? No, go read it yourself. It's actually quite a vibe. Basically, all you need to know is the one key thing in European Romanticism that will appeal to Americans a lot is going to be the idea of individualism and going against religious tradition. Now, not every European romanticist is going to be exactly those. I know Chateaubriand is going to actually go with the conservative side of things in France, but that's besides the point. Key characteristics of American Romanticism that are different is that stories were more personal, they were intense, emotional. And for Americans at the time, they felt attached to these things. They actually felt something in their soul, which is different from the deist, people who were very rational, who were exercised some kind of restraint in their writing. Nah, this time we're going full in. So writers from this era that you would know, maybe Washington Irving and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that's his book. Or maybe the book The Last of the Mohicans. I forgot who wrote it. Edgar Allan Poe. Everyone knows who Edgar Allan Poe is, right? Hopefully I don't need to tell you guys how he's intense or emotional in some ways. And also, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Again, you don't need to know any specifics as a literary scholar, but do know that there are influences from European Romanticism and the idea of individualism and independence. Let's move on to art. Now, if you paid attention to the slide, the title slide, you might recognize something in this slide here, and that's the Hudson River School. Now, the Hudson River School, not many people talk about. The Hudson River School is basically an artistic movement that will focus on landscape painting. And my God, there are some amazing landscape paintings from this era. The three principles of the landscape painting that the Hudson River School followed was discovery, exploration, and settlement. They wanted to capture the nature, the idea of freedom within these paintings. And the founder of the Hudson River School, that we so to speak, is going to be Thomas Cole. I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of his paintings before. But other examples of painters are going to be Frederick Edwin Church, John Frederick Kensett. An example of the Hudson River School is going to be from Albert Bierstedt, who's, by the way, a German, among the Sierra Nevada. And of course, I included Sierra Nevada because I'm Californian and I'm biased. So there's that. And then last but not least, we have neoclassical architecture. Now, this neoclassical is going to be a little bit different from federal. Federal is going to be something we might actually mistake it as colonial architecture. Things you might see in, like, Boston more frequently. Neoclassical architecture is what you actually think. It's going to be closely resembling of classical architecture from Rome or Greece. This time they have their own spin on it. Now, the influences of neoclassical, I already mentioned classical revival, but the countries that kind of started these trends were from Europe, specifically Italy, France, and Germany. And if you want some examples from those countries, those three countries about neoclassical, look at Brandenburg Gate, look at the Pantheon in Paris, look at the Arc de Triomphe, not the one from from the World Wars, but the one before that. And for Italy, do you really need to ask me about that? Literally, Rome was in Italy. So yeah, and Americans are going to adopt this. We're going to adopt this in the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the Jefferson Memorial. Jefferson was a big fan of neoclassical architecture. But another big fan of architecture, who's neoclassical architecture, I should say, is going to be Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And guess what? German. He's an American German. And one of his designs I included that still stands today is Baltimore Basilica. This is actually a huge Catholic, not institution, but, a place of worship for Catholics in Baltimore. Because if you guys remember, Maryland was kind of Catholic. It was a safe place for Catholic people. All right. Any questions about 4.9, American culture? He noticed it. Didn't Manifest Destiny go hand in hand with the Hudson River School? In some ways, yes. Manifest Destiny is going to be around the 40s, maybe the 30s, if you argue it enough. This painting was in 1868. It's still representative of the Hudson River School. When you read the Emerson thing in Lang. Yeah, I feel like this is common. You read transcendentalist texts. Kind of confusing, but once you read it, it kind of makes sense in some ways. I don't know. Thoreau seems to like being like. Yeah, one key thing about him is that he was just kind of in his own bubble, so to speak. The Transcendentalists are going to do something that we'll discuss in 4.11. Let me. Yay, Germans hate you, nativists. Don't we all? Okay. It looks like we don't have any more questions on 4.9. It is a fairly straightforward one because it's really short. And it's also not something that gets tested very often. But if you do want a little trivia, then there you go. Fun trivia. Now let's get to something that will be tested. Probably. Likelihood. That is the Second Great Awakening. Not to be confused with the First Great Awakening, though they are quite similar in some ways. So, why is the Second Great Awakening happening in this point? Same reason as the First Great Awakening. Religious ministers are going to notice that not a lot of people are going to church, and that's not good for us because they are going to hell. Again, oversimplification, but they do notice in the 1790s that there's going to be a downward trend in church attendance. So the response to this is going to be kind of unique compared to the First Great Awakening. It's a little similar to the First Great Awakening in that they will try to make Christianity approachable to all people. Remember, in the First Great Awakening, a lot of ministers will reject this idea of a predestined fate that the Puritans threw around so much because they're cringe. And the Second Great Awakening will do something similar. And they're going to follow the idea of the doctrine of free will. That it is your choice to give up your life as a sinner and live a good life, to live a godly life. In some parts, they were actually quite related to the Transcendentalists. They believed in self-improvement. They believed in self-reliance, self-determination, spiritual freedom, that you alone as an individual could take your kind of spirituality into your own hands. I hope I didn't sound too religious when I was saying all that, but that was the kind of vibe they were having. A result of the Second Great Awakening will be, again, similar to the First Great Awakening. During the First Great Awakening, we're going to see the rise of denominations, certain denominations. And the same thing happens here. This time, we're going to see the rise of different denominations. Of course, Presbyterians are going to still have some presence, Lutherans and all that. But we're going to see more Methodists and more Baptists. We're going to see more people registering with these churches. We're going to see a lot of people going to these camp meetings throughout. And also a key idea about, these sermons that these ministers did was that rich or poor, male or female, black or white, you are welcome in the kingdom of God. That's the basic idea. So that's why I should put in air quotes, democratizing Christianity. Eric Foner puts it that way. If you don't know who that is a famous U.S. historian. And the market revolution is actually going to be really important for this Second Great Awakening. There's going to be, we discussed in the market revolution, the rise of canals, railroads, good transportation. That's going to lead to mass participation. These ministers are going to be able to travel around the country in less time and set up these meetings in less time. And the direct result of this is going to be mass participation in religion. More people are going to go in, they're going to listen, and whether or not they're going to register, that's their choice. Free will, right? And there's going to be so much of these sermons and traveling and this religious fervor. It's going to lead to this concept of the burned over district in New York. They're going to go out west I'm not sure if it's considered upstate. I guess so in some ways. Throughout New York, and they're gonna do a lot of these, and people are gonna call it the burned over districts because there's so much religious fire, fervor in there, is that it's burned over in some ways. I don't know why. It's a weird thing to name, but College Board name dropped it, and I think it's an interesting idea. Do note that in this map I included all of these burned districts for the most part are west, not in the more popular areas like New York City, which would be somewhere down there by the port. Doesn't really matter. Who cares about New York City? That's a joke, by the way. Another thing about the market revolution relationship with religion, not only does it kind of help it in some ways, but the kind of social mobility and the morals, the moral questions that arise out of the market revolution are going to spur ministers to kind of conduct these sermons. The ministers are going to take a look at, there might be sins from a market society such as greed, apathy towards human suffering and all that. And so these ministers are going to emphasize moral behavior in a market society. And the three key things that they will emphasize over and over: industry, sobriety, and self-discipline. And they believe that these three ideas were the key to have a successful and stable kind of industrial culture in the North and the West. Obviously, they're not going to really care about the South because they had a moral issue there in the South. And I do want to note the majority of converts throughout the Second Great Awakening were from commercial and professional classes. Okay? So it's just not just rich business elite doing whatever the hell they wanted. It also reached out to people who were workers. Any questions about the Second Great Awakening? The third one is going to be industry. So the idea of industry is not literally like a factory or like textile industry, but more of being proactive in your work. A bit similar to the Puritans, but not obsessive like Puritans. And to answer your question, Freddie, I'm pretty sure temp lecturer applications are still open. But I would check with Lance. Okay. Any other questions about the Second Great Awakening? I know Freddie already took the A-Push exam, so he's not asking a question about the Second Great Awakening. Okay. Looks like no questions about the Second Great Awakening, so let's see if there are going to be any questions about the Second Great Awakening, because we have our analysis after this. We are going to look at an excerpt from Charles Grandison Finney, who was one of the ministers. I included his portrait. So this is a long passage. I apologize. It's a good thing I removed the second MCQ and the SAQ. Maybe we might go over time, depending on how we do with this analysis. So read through this passage from Charles G. Finney, and then try your best to answer the questions as best as you can. Part B should have been before Part A, but you know what? It doesn't matter. Just do your best on all of these parts. And I will give you guys... what's a good amount of time? Maybe 8 minutes? 8 to 10 minutes? We've been doing 8 to 10 minutes on these so far. It might be beneficial to do 8 to 10 minutes. So, work on this for 8 to 10 minutes. Check back in at 5:55, and then the hard deadline is going to be 5:57. And as always, ask me any questions. Just ask me any questions, clarification, all that. Oh, right, for the people at home. Here's the I've set up enough. I think our people at home can pause on that. As always, with this analysis, please try to do it. It's okay if you are not quite sure what your response should look like. I'm not particularly strict on this. I want to make sure you guys get the key points about the Second Great Awakening. That's all I really care about. It is around 4 minutes. How are we looking on time? It's always whenever we gotta go up to these analysis questions that people seem to drop out, even though that's what you should be doing as a historian, is analyzing. Maybe that or they have to go in the middle of that. You need a bit more time? So we are. Oh, you're handwriting it. Oh, okay. It is 10. You have 5 minutes left. Do you need more time than that? Okay, yeah. The max amount of time we were going to spend on this would be 10 minutes. And if you can, try to be as explicit as you can with the explanation, but you don't have to, write an SAQ level response. This is like something you would get from homework. If anyone else does want more time, just let me know. I'm more than open to it. It is a rather long passage. A lot of religious yapping, I guess. For those of you watching the recording, if you didn't get to catch it, here it is. Full screen, and pause it whenever you can. Okay, it is 5:54. I know Noodlezip is not typing, is writing it out. So we will not go for a thorough walkthrough. So yeah. For anyone else who's still working on it, do you need more time? And if you are almost done with the response, do you need time to edit your responses as well? Feel free to let me know. It's alright. It does take a while to read through the text and understand what's going on. But if you get fast enough, it's a good thing, right? For the AP histories. We got 1 minute left. If you have any thoughts, anything at all, finish it up. Oh, Freddie left. The A push, one of the A push veterans. No, you don't get more time for SAQs with stimulus. What happens is that they will just give you like 40 minutes. I think it is. Yeah, and then you use that 40 minutes to answer all 3 SAQs. So they don't restrict you with the SAQs. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, it's 5:57. Does anyone else need final time? That sentence did not make sense. Does anyone need more time before I start looking through responses? Looks like no one is typing, so some people might be copying, pasting, but I'm going to start looking through other responses. So let's go through part A. Why would Finney conduct this kind of sermon, and explain? So part A. He gave this sermon to convince people to take charge of their own morality, since not enough people were doing that. That's a reasonable response. Individualism and independence. Noodle, I assume you mean individual and independence in regards to religion, right? Is he effectively encouraging and pushing people to take charge of their religion, of their morality, and etc.? Okay. Yeah. Good responses. Let's look at part B then. What kind of principles does Finney outline in his... Finney is a weird name. In his sermon? Not acting sinful, not being selfish, and proactively choosing to act morally. Okay. Yes, choice. Emphasis on choice. Morality, and one has to change themselves rather than depending on God. Yes. Good response there. Let's move on to part C. Do you think that this sermon is similar to another philosophical or spiritual movement? Explain why. Probably same as others at the time, but I don't remember other names. Does the First Great Awakening count? Because it was also a calling for people to act more in accordance with God. The question was more focusing at the time. But yes, you could talk about the First Great Awakening. That's part D. More so part D. Where you would be more detailed. Let's look at this. Transcendentalism. So you did not explain why. Would you care to take some time to explain why transcendentalism? Transcendentalism did also focus on individualism. So yeah, that's a good key point. I'm seeing you guys are typing something, so I'll let you guys finish your thoughts before we move on to part D. Oh, Noodle stopped. Philosopher. Yeah, philosophy. Yeah. That's all right. First Great Awakening. That would be part D, though. Let's talk about part D. Compare this sermon to what you know about the First Great Awakening. How are they similar or different? It's similar because they think more and more people are acting in immoral days, and preachers want to change that. So you're more looking at the intentions of the two periods, right? And you're arguing that they are similar in that way. Yes, that's correct. Let's look at the other response. The First Great Awakening is about growing a personal relationship with God, but the second is more about what one can do for themselves. Okay. Yeah. I see where you're coming from. Of course, you guys didn't have the time to type out full responses. We're supposed to go through this quickly. Pretty good responses from you two. Are there any questions about this? About the source, about the Second Great Awakening? That was the intention of this entire discussion. Looks like we can move on to 4.11, which is on some certain effects of the Second Great Awakening. 4.11 is about an age of reform. Now, low-key, this is kind of misleading because we don't see huge reforms, like radical reforms such as suffrage or emancipation. That's later. We do see some progress, though. The rise of reform movements. So let's talk about the first thing. This is probably the least important part. Utopias and religion. So let's go with utopias in religion and communities. That's what this is all about. So one thing that seemed to be the trend in this time was that kinds of small communities would establish these own self-contained communities where they could freely practice their own beliefs and all that. So an example would be Brook Farm, which is kind of the transcendental vibe. I don't know. The transcendental meetup, the community farm there. Now, being people who were not exactly farmers or craftsmen and only wrote stuff, you could probably imagine how that went. Another utopian community would be, I am mispronouncing it because I'm misremembering it. The Oneida farm, as well as other religious communities like Shakers and Owenites. For the Shakers, Owenites, Oneida, Brook Farm, all of these were communities where people who shared this kind of belief that was not exactly mainstream or didn't align directly with certain Protestant denominations or, just the cultural zeitgeist and all that. All these people would meet up in the same places and build their own communities. Now, would they last permanently? Some of them might, or in that they would have to move, in the case of the Mormons. And others would probably just break apart for a variety of reasons. Whether or not they are practical or not, that's a assessment you can make about Brook Farm. The more important stuff is going to be the following three. So let's talk about moral and social reform. There are going to be the establishment of societies that will mainly involve religion as a motivator. And these reform societies are going to push certain ideas. So let's talk with the first kind of idea, temperance. What is temperance? What is the temperance movement? Don't drink alcohol. That's it. That's the temperance movement summarized. Now, temperance movement is not going to make any gains. They're going to barely make any gains at all. And they're actually going to decline for a moment in this period of time, 1800 to 1848. But they will make a comeback in Prohibition. And we might talk about that in detail, whether or not I feel like it. But just know that temperance societies were established by Protestant reformers. They usually just pushed a lot of people in many ways, maybe through publications, maybe through kind of group meetings, to kind of spread their cause, to reduce drinking, alcoholism among Americans. If you know anything about the alcohol intake of Americans in this time, it is actually terrifying. Alternatively, you could watch the oversimplified video on Prohibition. Of course, it's oversimplified. Another thing about the temperance movement is that Catholics would oppose it. Why? The majority of Catholics in America would be Irish people. And if you know anything about the Irish, I don't think it's very likely they will give up their good liquor. Same thing for Germans. Germans are also going to oppose liquor. Now, Germans are going to be a variety of Catholic and Protestants, but a good chunk of the Germans, both whether or not you're Catholic or Protestant, is also going to oppose the whole temperance movement, mainly because the alcohol industry. I'm just going to go put it that way. The alcoholic industry, whatever, is a key industry for Germans. Because they were good at brewing. So that's one thing to know about. The second one, the following two are not going to be entirely too important. So a second move was asylum reform to improve the treatments of psych wards and of psychological patients. And this will mainly be led by Dorothy Dix. Don't make any jokes about that. And the last thing to know about, it might be the most consequential in our lives because you're actually still being affected by it, is Horace Mann's movement and for common schools. At this time, not everyone could get an education. We didn't have publicly funded schools. So what Horace Mann and friends are going to advocate for is a system where there are going to be schools that will be funded by states that children can go to. And if that sounds familiar, a good chunk of you are going through that right now. So blame Horace Mann for that. That's just a side effect of the market revolution, baby. So that's it for moral and social reform. The next two are actually important. Like, if you want a big takeaway from this, it's abolitionism and feminism. So let's start with abolitionism. Abolitionism, I already defined, is the push for emancipation and for the rights of African Americans. Now, this will have some headway in the North. We will see emancipation in the North. Some state governments, despite the fact that they will give some African Americans citizenship and their freedom, some of them might restrict their rights, like their right to vote or their right to do anything else in life. Good examples of emancipation like efforts is the Amistad case in 1841. Basically, Amistad case was the instance of slaves taking over a Spanish schooner, killing the captain and specifically the cook for whatever reason, and they ended up crashing this ship in New York. What ended up happening was a court case between U.S. v. Amistad, in which good news happened for the slaves. They were kind of given citizenship. They were treated as if they were citizens, and they did give them kind of the way back home, back to West Africa. That's where these slaves were from. Now, do you need all the details of U.S. v. Amistad? No, unless you're going to African American studies. And the abolitionist movement will grow in the North very intensely due to publications, newspapers, slave narratives, and religious sermons. So examples of publications/newspapers: The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. Publications from David Walker, discussions and meetings with Maria Stuart, slave narratives from Frederick Douglass, religious sermons just in general viewed slavery to be a moral evil. And furthermore, these new publications and newspapers will spread particularly in the North and West because market revolution, circulation, transportation, from the railroads and the canals, the rise of urban centers. So these publications will be seen by more people. That was not a cohesive thought, but hopefully you get the idea that abolitionism was starting to be a steadily growing force in the North and the West. As for feminism, feminism also goes on the rise alongside with abolitionism. In fact, a good chunk of abolitionists supported feminism, and a good chunk of feminists supported abolitionism. So they're kind of interchanged. Examples would include the Grimke sisters, who are actually born in the South, but they will migrate over to the North and support the Liberator, will gain support from William Lloyd Garrison himself, actually. And what they're going to do is they're going to have talks around about feminist ideals and will push for the abolitionist cause. Another person I named was Maria Stuart. Maria Stuart was a black woman, so obviously she would support abolitionism and she would also support feminism in many ways. Actually, she's an interesting character as well. A variety of African American women will be part of the push for abolitionism and feminism as well. And we will discuss a little bit about the women's movement after the Civil War and what happened to black women after that. But for now, outside our time frame. Now, the feminist movement is going to come to a head at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where they will draft the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And I included the signatories of that. As you might notice, men were also there. So it's not just women who were there. They will be drafted by leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Lucy Stone. Those are examples of feminist in the movement. And all four of them, and a good chunk of feminists are actually going to, and also Catherine Beecher, but I don't think she was at the convention, are all going to praise women's roles as educators. And remember, when I discussed cult of domesticity, women either worked in the household or worked as educators. Now, women believed that being an educator was a virtue. And that was something that was one of the points that they prided themselves in the feminist movement. Emphasis that women actually had an important role in the education of Americans. So yeah, that's all you really should know about the feminist movement at this point of time. Obviously, it's going to become very, very significant when we discuss the 20th century. All right, that's it for 4.11. Any questions about that? I'm reaching a point where I'm getting thirsty. Women hating alcohol. Yeah, Daughters of Temperance. It looks like you guys don't have any question about reform movements. Give me confirmation, please. That'll be really nice. Yep, no questions? Okay. We have 2 more topics left. We might actually have time to watch me write an MCQ and look for an SAQ. We'll see. African Americans in the early republic. I'm not going to go full AP African American studies, but all these 3 points are things you should know about African Americans at this time. So, in regards to slave trade, what we did was we banned international slave trade in 1808. It was part of an agreement. Congress did that. The problem is that, well, the compromise involving banning international slave trade was that they would maintain interstate slave trade. And the reason why the slave trade doesn't die is, well, make them have babies. That's what some people did. Again, it's messed up. Slavery as a whole is messed up. That should go without saying. But the interstate slave trade was self-sufficient. Again, the interstate slave trade is going to be as cruel as the international slave trade. Now, I didn't make this whole point about the Middle Passage, but for the Middle Passage, they stuffed slaves in very crowded spaces, and there were no bathrooms. So slaves actually peed and pooped and got smelly. Disease was rampant. Many slaves died of disease in that Middle Passage. What's going to happen in the interstate slave trade is going to be the second Middle Passage. Now, they're not going to be kept in tight spaces like they were in those ships. But what's going to happen during the interstate slave trade as well, as they are having more children, as the interstate slave trade becomes more self-sufficient, there's going to be slave auctions, and they are going to separate family units. And if you know anything about family and the psychology of slave auctions, this will be devastating to a good chunk of African Americans. And we will talk about ways how African American communities faced these kinds of separations, how they continue to bear this kind of suffering later on. Now, what African Americans did is that they just didn't stay there and do nothing. In fact, that was completely wrong. It was very common for African Americans to resist their status as slaves. Sometimes they did a form of everyday resistance. Maybe they broke tools, they faked illnesses, they worked slowly, and probably the most effective would be escaping via the Underground Railroad to the north or even to Canada. Now, the other side of resistance is violence. And we're going to see mainly 2 major instances. Going to be Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. Nat Turner's rebellion is actually going to be quote-unquote successful because they actually do something. Denmark Vesey's rebellion was actually a conspiracy, and it was prevented beforehand. So just know from this that African Americans did whatever they could to resist their conditions, whether through violence or just out of pure spite. Now, they will form their own... Oh, if you do want the dates, by the way, Denmark Vesey was 1822, and Nat Turner was in 1831. I did include a very biased depiction of Nat Turner's rebellion. And hopefully you can tell that it's very biased by the depiction. Anyways, let's move on to African American communities. How did they deal with it? There were three key things that really connected African Americans: religion, family, and music. Music and dance. And these three principles will remain true in the North and the South. Remember, in the North, not all things were peachy. They were discriminated against. They had their rights restricted. So, of course, naturally, they're going to have to band together and form their own kind of communities, right? So, what did religion do? Actually, in the First Great Awakening, I think I might have failed to mention this, some African Americans were actually converted to Christianity during the First Great Awakening. The particular reason, not exactly the most important, but that was kind of a phenomenon that did happen. I also did mention the fact that apparently white parishioners were bad at singing, and they found that African Americans were good at singing, so they included them in gospel. There's whole documents on that, not important again. But do know that churches such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church provided support for African American communities, whether or not it was in the South or whether or not it was in the North. Particularly in the North, they would provide, and they would have these kinds of meetings in these churches. And for the South, well, worship. And really what you could really do if you weren't able to escape, or you weren't able to, if you understood that violence might lead to violence on you, the only thing you could really hope for was turn to religion. And religion is going to be a powerful thing to motivate these African American slaves to keep on going, to not give up. And part of that, again, all that is actually also related to family and music. Family units will be formed after auctions. People will begin to adopt names. People will, and when I say people, African Americans. African Americans will form tight bonds, and they will be attached to those bonds. And actually, even after emancipation, family is going to be so important that they're going to go on long journeys looking for each other. Some of them failed because they might have died from disease, and some of them will succeed. So there's that about the family. Now, music and dance. Jazz is amazing. That's unimportant. What's really important about music and dance is that music and dance has been a part of West African traditions. And part of the things that they did, again, I've emphasized this throughout Unit 2 and Unit 3, is that they're going to maintain these traditions. They're going to continue music. They're going to continue dance. And sometimes music would be another way of coping with their condition. Sometimes they will sing spirituals. And the content of the spirituals might be, I hope that I look forward to see the day I'm free, stuff like that. Now, these spirituals will also turn into gospels when you combine them with the fact that religion existed. And we'll see the rise of gospel music in black churches as well. And finally, we see the rise of blues. Again, is a bit of like a branch of spirituals, and the blues are all another kind of way for African Americans to cope with their condition. So yeah. It would be worthy to note that African Americans who were free will also support other African Americans. They will very likely become abolitionists. I already mentioned Maria Stewart. I mentioned Frederick Douglass. But also Sojourner Truth, the conductors of the Underground Railroad. And David Walker is also another example of... did I mention David Walker? I might have not. But David Walker will also be a free African American who will publish essays throughout the North, much like Frederick Douglass will debate and then also publish his slave narrative. Any questions about African Americans? At this point in time, I should say. No questions? I'm going to wait for a little tiny bit. Looks like you guys got it. I think it's fairly straightforward in some ways, yeah. So let's move on with the last topic. Society of the South. Ugh. Anyways, not that I'm biased against Southerners, but some of the things I will discuss in this might be blatantly disgusting. So, what do you need to know about Southerners? Well, the majority of them didn't actually own slaves. It was actually the planter aristocracy that owned more than 50 slaves. I include a graphic of slave ownership among Southerners in 1850. However, this does not mean that yeoman farmers were kind of in solidarity with African Americans, even though both were in the marginal sides of Southern society. No. Yeoman farmers actually believed in their racial superiority of white people, and they also desired to have slaves to kind of move into the planter aristocracy. Now, I'll take a moment to explain why slavery is important in the South, or to Southerners. It's the backbone of their economy. With the rise of the cotton gin, textile mills, we got more demand for cotton. And so, the South will take up that mantle as the cotton producer. And the North is going to be, all right, you guys grow the cotton, you bring it over here, we process that cotton, and we give it to you guys, and we give some of the clothes, the products we make with that cotton, and we're also going to sell that out to wherever we want to go, maybe Britain, maybe France, wherever it is, and profit. So that's the kind of relationship, and I did mention this relationship very early in Unit 4, but in case you're not aware, there's that, the Cotton Kingdom. So that's why many Southerners will want to have slaves. It's profitable for them. But again, do know that African Americans, pretty much a lot of white people were, in the South at least, were fully against African Americans. They desired to own them as slaves. Another interesting thing about plantations is that they're going to be isolated communities. It's like as if they are their own nation. In fact, Frederick Douglass has an interesting quote on it. It's like as if they have their own regulations, as if they have their own economy, as if they're independent on their own. That's because they are sparse, and they're going to be mainly controlled by one man, and it's the master. He's going to adopt the idea of paternalism. He's the big chief in the whole plantation. And if anyone goes out of line, he's going to punish you. And most of these punishments are going to be cruel, mainly towards the slaves, but sometimes also towards his wife. And some of these men are also going to start adopting this idea of code of honor, that if you insult them, it's time to duel, baby. That last part is probably not important. But this idea of paternalism is actually something I want to emphasize on, because his mistress, the master's wife, would be considered or would be expected to be submissive to his rules. Of course, he would also emphasize the idea of racial superiority. So there's that kind of culture among Southerners. Despite the fact that a lot of Southerners did not own slaves, a lot of them are going to defend slavery, which is why I don't really like them in this time, and nobody should. They're going, instead of looking at slavery as, it's just something, it's not great. Men are all created equal, but this is something that's happened. Thomas Jefferson, anyways. But actually, Calhoun and friends, I single out Calhoun because I don't like him. But a good chunk of Southern politicians are going to say, no, Thomas Jefferson is wrong. Not all men are created equal. White people on top. I just realized I said this out loud in the dorm. People know that I am not that type of person. Anyways, they're going to say, no, Jefferson is wrong. Slavery is, in fact, a positive good. And the way they defend slavery is going to be wishy-washy. There's going to be quote-unquote intellectual defense. They believe that slavery was a way for white people to civilize Africans, which is disgusting. They believe that by converting them to Christianity, they were serving a noble purpose. They believe that also plantation life was peaceful. And they even argued that being an industrial worker in the North was so much worse than being a slave in the South. Now, getting whipped so many times every week is probably not better than working a 9-to-5 dead-end job. I don't know. Some of you guys might debate me on that, but I don't like physical pain from all that. Now, that isn't to say that the North is all peachy, of course. Labor movements existed in the North and West. But they compared themselves to the North, believing that, oh, well, there's all this. We're clearly better. And that's why slavery is a good thing. Again, the defense for slavery is all wishy-washy. And sometimes they even said they used religion as a justification, even though clearly it's the religious, the ministers in the North who were on doing sermons. That statement just broke my mind. Oh, that's wild. Anyways, sometimes they also used religion as a justification. I already mentioned converting African Americans. They were serving a noble purpose. And the religious ministers in the North are obviously going to look through this and like, no, you're wrong on so many levels. And they are wrong on so many levels. Now, additionally, this is going to be related to African Americans in the early republic, but as the South, as America as a whole is expanding west, as we got our Louisiana Purchase, as we started settling west, we started expanding slavery down in the South. We expanded it to Missouri. We expanded it all the way to Texas. And this starts to become an issue. And actually, the Western expansion of slavery is pretty much the direct build-up to Unit 5 when we discuss the road to Civil War. Now, why did Southerners choose to expand slaves to the West rather than just concentrate them in one area? Well, actually, as it turns out, if you're planting and, farming a lot of stuff on land without, practicing good agricultural stuff, and giving the soil time to not die, then you're going to get arable soil and it's no longer going to be profitable to grow stuff on that dead soil. So pretty much they're going to move west to find more soil to grow their plantation and cash crops on. And that's the last key idea, expansion of slavery. Any questions about the South? I'm sorry if I ended on a bad note, by the way. Seems that I also ended on a bad note on Unit 3 or Unit 2. But Unit 5 does pick up with slavery and the road to Civil War. No questions on the South? Pretty sure most units end on a bad note. Oh, Unit 9 really ends on a bad note. Anyways. Looks like you guys don't have any questions. Is that correct? Am I not making any horrible assumptions about your thoughts? Or your understanding? No questions? Okay, awesome. Well, it's 6:30. We could probably go through an SAQ and an MCQ, but little tiny announcement would be that, yeah, if you guys want to go through an MCQ and an SAQ, and since you guys don't seem to have no questions, hold on, feedback, there it is, fill out that feedback form, please. Anyways, if you guys do want to do an SAQ and MCQ or walk through the CED, let me know, because we have half an hour left, because I planned out 2 hours. There we go. There's a link to the feedback form. Do you guys want to go through an SAQ or an MCQ or both? Or maybe a walkthrough through the CED? What do you guys think is advantageous, works best for you, and all that? You guys want to do a walkthrough, the CED? Okay, let's go over it. I'm down. All right. Let me quickly open up and scroll down to Unit. God, Unit 4 is long, even though it's like 48 years. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see my screen? Do you see the CED? This is the CED. It's not exactly a spectacular document. In fact, I kind of hate it, but it's the only thing I have to work with because I'm not reading through APUSH textbooks over again. I don't have the time of an AP teacher. Anyways, let's get started. So again, 4.1 I skip because it's a preview of what you're going to learn, and well, there's no point in doing that. So, rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson. You need to know about the first party system, kind of their issues, right? I'm going to have to talk, and you guys should know about Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland, because those are the Supreme Court decisions that they are particularly referring to in regard to the judiciary and the federal laws take precedence over state laws. Yeah. Louisiana Purchase. Let's see. Means of including exploration. I mentioned Lewis and Clark. Diplomatic efforts. Louisiana Purchase in the first place, but also the Adams-Onis Treaty, kind of asserting American presence in the Western Hemisphere. Yes, Embargo Act. Oh, wait. Yeah, this is why I don't like College Board. These are some optional sources. I mentioned the Embargo Act. I didn't mention Tariff of 1816. It's not particularly important. Let's move on down to 4.3, Politics and Regional Interest. I should probably check the chat every now and then to see if you guys are asking me to go over something again. Okay, politics and regional interests. Regional interest often trumped national concerns as the basis for many political leaders' position on slavery and economic policy. That's the primary thing. Slavery and economic policies. That's a disagreement between the North and the South. Sectional conflict. The American system was an example of this kind of division regarding the economy. American system, which favored industry and didn't really favor the South, which is why Southerners opposed it and Northerners and Westerners supported it. We did try to do some compromises, like the Missouri Compromise, which was in 1820, but this was only a temporary fix. There were constant roads to war happening everywhere. Nullification crisis. The Compromise of 1850. You get the pattern here, and we're going to talk about that very closely in Unit 5. 4.4, America on the world stage. Pretty much Monroe Doctrine and the War of 1812 is all you really need to know about it. What else did I mention in the lecture? I should have mentioned the Adams-Onis Treaty. Yes, there's that, but those are also kind of expansion. That's the sought to claim territory throughout North American continent and promote foreign trade. That's the Adams-Onis Treaty. They also did have a Barbary War thing. Not sure if that particularly makes sense, but I guess it does. This development sought influence over through the variety of means. That's the Adams-Onis Treaty as well. War of 1812, I guess, in some ways. Seminole Wars, American Indian removal. That's what Jackson is big on. The Monroe Doctrine, Europe, chill out with North America and South America. That's our sphere of influence. Except they don't end up enforcing that. That's one thing I do want to emphasize on. Any questions so far? I do want to go through the CED a little quickly to see if we want to go through practice. I'm seeing no questions so far. Let's move on to the market revolution. Sorry if I didn't give you guys enough time to type out your question. Just type it out whenever. So this is heavy. You got 4 developments. So key ideas, technologies, the rise of manufacturing in the North primarily and in the West. Transportation networks, mainly between the North and the West, not quite significant in the South. The rise of Cotton Kingdom in the South as well. And also the tie between the Cotton Kingdom and the North and West. Those are things you should know. Again, small little examples. Now, society and culture. things that developed out of the market revolution. What do you need to know? The expanding middle class and the rise of the business elite. Prosperity and their living standards, primarily in those classes, were improved. We also saw the influx of immigrants, primarily from Germany and Ireland. The reason for Ireland was the Great Irish Potato Famine, in which the British were absolute parasites. And the Germans came because religious freedom or political turmoil going on there in Europe as well. Both of them will mainly settle in the north and the west. The Irish will primarily be factory workers. The German will primarily settle in the Midwest and do a variety of things, sometimes factory workers, farmings, craftsmen, and all that. Both of these groups will face extreme prejudice from the nativist movement. We're going to see the return of the nativists when we get to the Gilded Age in Unit 6. What else do we know? Oh yes, gender and family roles. We move away from the idea of Republican motherhood, again, to redefine Republican motherhood, the idea that women had an important role in teaching kids American Republican values, is going to be more redefined as, you stay home, honey. That was really offensive. But that's the idea. The cult of domesticity, that women should stay in the private sphere, at least in the middle class, but we do see women work, right? The textile mills. Pretty much it. Domestic servants and all that. So there's that. Any questions about that? I think this particular topic might be the most confusing. Karam, if you would like to speak, please type your question in the chat instead. You have a complaint. Okay. What is your complaint? For anyone who else actually has a question, please type your question. I was receiving it by Pyramid, and his screen was not working. Unfortunately, I'm not the person to talk to. I work with social studies, so I also don't know what to do about that. I'll bring them. I guess I can bring that up with him. I'm not sure though. But okay, let's continue on. Before we continue, any questions on 4.6? We're halfway through the unit. Very brief unit review. Alright, if not, then let's keep on going to 4.7, expanding democracy. Oh boy. Just the key idea, just know that instead of just landed white men, period, could vote. That's it. Now, their involvement in being able to vote will lead to the rise of the second political party. That's it. And with that second political party is going to be the Democrats and the Whigs. Democrats will mainly be led by Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun will be part of that. Whigs will be led by Henry Clay, who is absolute Chad, by the way. Should have been president. Anyways, again, their disagreements were mainly about national bank tariffs, the American system just as a whole, as well as the role of the federal government. So there's that. What Jackson did pretty much expanded federal power, ironically, actually, and mainly to achieve his goals. To kill the national bank effectively, to remove Native Americans from the South and move them over to Oklahoma, which is the absolute worst thing you could do to anyone. And yeah, that's pretty much a nullification crisis. I feel like I was forgetting something. Asserting the dominance of the federal government over state governments, which is interesting because this happened with Andrew Jackson somehow. Okay, let's keep on going. 4.9, I don't think I need to say too much about this, but know that American elements, liberal values, combined with European influences, created national culture, right? American Romanticism, the Hudson River School, neoclassical architecture. So know that if you want to. It's good. The optional sources are all just trivia stuff, to be perfectly honest. Okay, let's move on to the Second Great Awakening. Market revolution. Then notice that less people were in church leads to the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening will respond to social mobility as well. And they are going to try to attempt to make Christianity approachable to a lot of people, right? Democratizing Christianity, as Eric Foner puts it. So far, any questions on this? Not particularly the Second Great Awakening, but all the units topics before. Seems like no one is typing, so let's move on. 4.11, Age of Reform. This one's a little bit more long. This is literally the most useless thing they included. Like, this is a no-brainer if you included this. Anyways, I like to criticize College Board wherever I can. So, what the Second Great Awakening will lead to. Religious, social movements. Let's focus on the social movements because they're actually the most important. We see the rise of temperance societies that wanted people to drink less. We see the rise of abolitionism, primarily in the North, not in the South, mainly in the North. They called for emancipation, that called for, just emancipation in general. And we also see the growth of free African American populations in the North. That is something I forgot to mention. Good thing I'm going through the CED. This part, I don't think you should really study thoroughly about because I mentioned publications, slave narratives, the growth in the sentiment that, hey, slavery is cringe and not a moral thing to do in the North. Sorry, I feel strongly about it. But we also see the rise of women's rights, of feminists pushing for greater equality, but also expressing ideals, democratic ideals at the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, this key part, over time, arguments emerged over whether to narrow the goals to white women. Yes, this caveat with that was that it did happen. And this will actually kind of lead to a rift between African Americans and white women in particular, but I think that's mentioned in Unit 5. So we'll reserve that last part for Unit 5. A bunch of optional documents. You don't need to read through all of it. African Americans in the early republic. Yes, anti-slavery, largely unsuccessful in the South, mainly slave rebellions. But African Americans as a whole created communities, ways to cope with all of this kind of separation and all that. And of course, they joined political efforts to promote emancipation, which seems like a no-brainer, right? Oh, there's the German Coast Uprising, but you don't really care. I don't know why this is relevant. All this, you don't need to read through all this. Society of the South in the early republic. Despite the fact that the South, despite the fact that the majority of the South did not own slaves, they still defended it, which is what makes them crappy. Anyways, the kind of identity among Southerners was that racial superiority. That's about it. And the ways they defended slavery was that, oh, it's a good thing. We're doing good for these slaves when you're literally whipping them 25 times every day. Or sometimes even chopping limbs off. And we see the expansion of slavery to the West, and we leave that off when we we'll pick that up in Unit 5 when we discuss antebellum, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So, that's the whole CED. The last topic is a historical thinking skill. So any questions about any content in Unit 4? Does every topic, well, not every topic, do the majority of the topics seem like you understand? Do you understand all the topics that I just went through? And if you don't remember what all the topics are, let me scroll up real quick. This is not real quick. Here it is. Unfortunately, you can't see. So 4.2 to 4.6 is all this. Let me ask that. Do you guys understand it all? Good. Okay. All this, you guys understand it all. You guys think that if I asked you a question about it, you would feel mainly I'm not going to ask you any specialized question, please. But you're confident if you're given a DBQ, an LEQ, or an SAQ on these topics, you feel confident that you will come into the exam and not blink immediately. LEQ, EU. Eventually, we're going to tackle some LEQ prompts. Not fully do an LEQ, but an outline of LEQs. Okay. So, we do have 10 minutes left. It will take me a while to look for an SAQ or an MCQ. Do you guys, would you guys like it if I, looked for an SAQ or type up an MCQ and add them to the slides for you guys to attempt later? Would you guys like it if I did that? That was not even a question. Yes, please? Okay. I don't think it would be entirely beneficial for you guys to watch me attempt to write a good MCQ within the time we have, or to look for a good SAQ for you guys to attempt. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave it up here, and I'm going to pretty much end the lecture unless there are any questions. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it up to any questions you guys have. And if there are no longer any questions, I will get to work on those immediately, and I will post the slides and the lecture recording on the lecture calendar as per usual. As for the Kahoots and the quizzes, I do not make those. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. But there is some quiz. Yes, there's. I think it's likely there is a Quizlet. But I'm not gonna promote things that College Board will shoot me in my sleep for. So I'm not gonna do that. Hopefully you guys do have access to AP Classroom. That might be useful in some ways. It's not the most useful thing out there. But yeah, you could look into that as well. Aside from that, you guys feel confident with Unit 4? Some people say that they don't even know what's in Unit 4, which is actually a bit shocking, but because Missouri Compromise is in Unit 4, Jackson is in Unit 4. Questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace until my office hours, which is going to be, I think, this Friday or this Saturday. Not this Saturday, the next coming Saturday. If not, then I think we are good to end it off here. Hopefully this lecture has been beneficial, has helped you in some ways. For the people who are watching the recording, hopefully it has been useful for you as well. As for the slides, they will be updated. Unfortunately, you will probably not have the answer to the SAQs or my feedback from the SAQs or my feedback for the MCQ. But I will type up an explanation and all that when we get closer to the AP exam, if you need to do any last minute revision in that area. So keep an eye out for that. All right. I think that's it. thank you guys so much for sticking it to the end. And I will maybe see some of you guys when we talk about Unit 5, which is probably the most depressing part. Probably not, actually. So I'm going to end the lecture recording here.